Welcome to another episode of Erik Wait Whiskey Studies, and in this video I'm going to talk about Grain Scotch Whisky production. And as I go over my notes, I'm going to have a wee dram of the Compass Box Hedonism. It's a blended grain Scotch whiskey bottled at 43% alcohol by volume. I've already reviewed this whiskey, but I'll be reviewing it as we go over my notes. If you're not familiar with grain Scotch whiskey, I want to highly recommend you check out this one. Fairly readily available, but in comparison to other grain Scotch whiskeys that I've had, I would say it's one of the better ones out there. In a previous series on Scotch whiskey production, I stated that my goal was to provide more information about the process of making Scotch whiskey than what you will hear in a typical Scotch distillery tour. But I didn't want to go so deep that you'd need a degree in chemistry to understand the content of the videos. Although I did talk about column stills, I mostly focused on malt Scotch whiskey. So if you haven't watched those 10 videos, I want to highly recommend them because there is some overlap between grain Scotch whiskey production and malt Scotch whiskey production. So a lot of what you need to know about Scotch whiskey production will be in those videos. In this video on a grain Scotch whiskey production, I want to do a deep dive into the subject. While blended Scotch makes up 90% of sales market, much of it goes into cocktails. The 10% of the market that makes up single malt whiskey has a greater fan base. Also, while single malt Scotch whiskey distilleries tend to be beautiful estates with pagodas, shiny stills, and rustic dunnage warehouses, a grain Scotch whiskey distillery is a lot like a factory, and the process is a lot more modern and complex. For a textbook level understanding on the topic, I want to recommend Whiskey, Technology, Production, and Marketing, edited by Ingle Russell and Graham Stewart. It is written for the reader who is more than a mere whiskey enthusiast. It is a scholarly work and well worth the read if you're up for it, but it also seems to assume the reader has a prior understanding of whiskey production terminology and chemistry, as it uses a lot of technical terms without defining them. So the goal of this video is to bridge the gap between what's typically found on the internet and that textbook. Also in this video, I will provide an overview of the 8 stages of grain Scotch whiskey production, and then in subsequent video, I'll talk about the various grain Scotch distilleries. Scotch whiskey terminology. Scotch whiskey terminology can be a bit confusing to the newcomer. All whiskey is made from one or more of 4 grains, or cereal: barley, corn, also known as maize, wheat, or rye. In Scotland, if the barley is malted, it may simply be referred to as malt to distinguish it from corn, wheat, or rye, which are typically only identified on a bottle of Scotch whiskey as grain without identifying whether it is wheat or corn or rye. Wheat, however, is the main cereal used by Scotch whiskey grain distilleries, though corn is still being used. Types of Scotch whiskey. Scotland produces 2 types of whiskey: malt Scotch whiskey and grain Scotch whiskey. If it is from a single distillery, it is a single malt Scotch whiskey or a single grain Scotch whiskey. Otherwise, it is a blended malt Scotch whiskey or blended grain Scotch whiskey. If the casks that go into the bottling are from more than one distillery. If malt Scotch whiskey is blended with grain Scotch whiskey, it is categorized simply as blended Scotch whiskey. So a single malt Scotch whiskey is actually a single distillery malted barley Scotch whiskey. But that's just too long to put on a bottle, so they got to shorten it. So the single always referred to the distilleries, not to the quantity of casks. So typically a single malt Scotch whiskey, unless it says single cask, is from a multitude of casks, but from one distillery. And so in that sense, all whiskeys are blended It's just a matter of whether it's a blended of distilleries or just a blended of casks. But for clarification, for clarity, distilleries typically want to talk about a marriage of casks rather than a blending of casks. The definition of these two categories, malt Scotch whisky and grain Scotch whisky, is determined not just by the type of grain used, but the type of still that is used to convert the wash to new make spirit. According to the 2009 Scotch Whisky Association regulations, malt Scotch whisky must be made in a pot still. So if a whiskey is made from 100% malted barley, but it is from a column still, it is classified as a grain whiskey. Much of the Scotch grain whiskey production is the same as Scotch malt whiskey production. The two primary differences are the method of converting starch to sugar to create the wort and the type of still to create the new make spirit. So I will primarily focus on these two topics and provide links to my other videos on Scotch whisky production when needed to provide more information. So on the nose, I get lemon, a little bit of orange, a lot of vanilla, sort of a powdered sugar. It's real clean, a hint of floral notes. Let's move on. There are a variety of options to produce grain Scotch whisky, such as 1. Using wheat or corn. 2. Milled grain or unmilled grain. 3. Pressure cooking or atmospheric and low temperature processing. Or 4. Batch distillation or continuous distillation. Each of these has its own individual features and its own advantages and disadvantages in relation to the available technology. On the palate. So, grain Scotch whisky, single grain, blended grain doesn't get a whole lot of talk among in the whiskey community. But I think it has a very distinct niche within Scotch whisky production that could gain a fan base, a very special fan base, because it has a real nice silky texture. If you're a bourbon fan, you may like this in terms of texture. It has a lot of the vanilla character that you would have in a bourbon. Of course, the big difference is the climate in Scotland is nothing like the climate in Kentucky or Texas or other places in the United States that have a lot more heat, so that you would get a lot more extraction from a cask. And of course, bourbon has to be made with new charred oak, whereas they can use first fill, second fill bourbon cask typically in a bottle like this. But nevertheless, this is almost like, in terms of the profile, a cool climate bourbon. The 8 stages of grain Scotch whisky production. The following is an overview of the grain Scotch whisky production process. First is the grain. A selection of cereals can be used in grain whisky production in Scotland, including malted barley, wheat, corn, and rye. In the past, the most common grain was corn, also known as maize, but today it is wheat, as it is the most economical. Malted barley is also used in the mash bill, as it provides necessary enzymes needed for starch conversion to sugar. Technically, according to Scotch whisky regulations, if a malt whisky is made in a column still rather than a pot still, it must be classified as a grain whisky. For example, Loch Lomond Distillery produces their signature single grain whisky using a mash of 100% malted barley that is then distilled using a column still. So you could almost think of a single malt as a single distillery malted barley pot still distilled Scotch whisky, if you want to throw in that other distinctive that is needed to classify it as a single malt. 2. Milling, converting the cereal into flour. For a grain whisky, the cereal is typically ground into a fine flour in a hammer mill, whereas a roller mill, commonly used for barley, uses 2 sets of rollers running at different speeds, the first set to crack open the barley and the second to crush the barley into grist. A hammer mill pulverizes the grain into smaller pieces by repeated blows of small hammers. A hammer mill is essentially a steel drum containing a vertical or horizontal rotating shaft or drum on which hammers are mounted. The hammers are free to swing on the ends of the cross or fixed to the central rotor. The rotor is spun at a high speed inside the drum while material is fed into a feed hopper. The grain is impacted by hammer bars and is thereby shredded and expelled through screens in the drum of a selected size. The basic theory is the finer the flour, the easier it is for malt enzymes that will be added later in the mash to access the carbohydrates and convert them into shorter chain fermentable sugars that the yeast can access. So typically the roller mills are used at malt distilleries. You typically see the Robert Bobby mill and you see the Porteous mill if you're doing a distillery tour. The hammer mill is typically used for grain whiskey. However, there are two malt distilleries that use it, which is Tinanek and Inchdarney. And they have their own reasons for using it. But generally speaking, there's always an exception to everything, right? Exception to the rule. Hammer mills are used for grain whiskey production, and roller mills are used for malt whiskey production. Now, to explain the rollers a little bit, you have a larger one and typically a slightly smaller one, and they run at different speeds in order so that as they're turning and the barley goes in between them, it's the different speeds that tends to cause a little bit of friction so that they get caught in between them and they're split open like that, and they're cracked open or split open. That's the idea of a roller mill. Whereas a hammer mill, it's just creating your fine flour right there from the mill. Step 3, cooking. Gelatinizing the starch. The base grain, wheat or corn, is cooked under pressure in order to gelatinize or soften the starch. When the cooking process is completed, the malted barley is added for its enzymes. Other variables involved in the cooking process may include the use of backset, whole wheat, the Maillard reaction, blowdown, and retrogradation. I think the market for grain Scotch whiskey, whether it's single grain or malted, is not only someone who wants maybe a less intense bourbon that's a little more fruity, a little bit more floral, but I think it's a summertime whiskey, something that's lighter. It reminds me a lot of, say, of a California Chardonnay, although a lot of California Chardonnays have a heavy dose of malolactic fermentation, which gives you a lot of those buttery notes. It's not buttery, but other than that, in terms of vanilla from the oak and the fruit characteristics and the floral characteristics, it reminds me a lot of a California Chardonnay. Backset is a recycled portion of the stillage from the distillation when most of the solid matter has been removed, either by centrifugation or screening, and is used in certain cases as a supplement to the processed liquor. Although backset can be quite acidic, when it is used properly, it is considered to provide important benefits, particularly during fermentation. Backset can provide nutrients that are essential for yeast growth, but too much can result in an oversupply of certain minerals and ions, such as sodium and lactate, which can suppress fermentation. Backset is now considered an essential requirement for the successful operation of low-temperature cooking processes, and it is an important aspect of the integration of processing, water management, co-products, and energy recovery systems. Whole grain and Maillard reactions. While using whole grains rather than mill grains can contribute more alcohol, it can take more time and consequently result in Maillard reactions. Maillard are a highly complex series of reactions that take place between sugars and amino acids or proteins under high temperature conditions and produce a range of dark pigmented products. The occurrence of Maillard reactions during cooking is important because they result in the uptake and degradation of both fermentable carbohydrate and amino acids, and could have a significant impact on spirit yield. They also have implications for downstream processing and the potential to cause problems with co-products. As a side note, Maillard reactions can also occur when using a direct fire pot still in making malt whiskey. So if you have heard of Maillard reactions, typically it's associated or likened to a creme brulee, where you have a creme brulee and they take a little torch and they sort of cook the sugar on the top of a creme brulee. Well, in a direct fire still, such as they have a Glenfarclas or a Springbank or a Glenfiddich, rather than using a steam coil to heat the pot still, they have a direct fire, which can then, with remnants of the husk, anything that came over from the wort, various proteins inside the pot still, can sort of cook it, give a little cook it, which then gives you that sort of creme brulee character. And some distilleries like that. Glenfarclas had switched to steam coil. They didn't like it. They wanted that creme brulee character, so they went back to a direct fire. Well, that Maillard reaction, if you're talking about in the conversion of grain into a wort, then you're burning off some of your sugar. And the result is that if you're burning off some of your sugar, you can't produce as much alcohol. So there's a decision to be made. Now, generally speaking, grain whiskeys hammer mill the grain, which is typically going to be wheat these days in Scotland. However, you could use whole grain, which has the potential of giving you more alcohol, but it's going to take longer, and you could end up burning some of it, that whole grain, which would then give you the Maillard reaction, which would then reduce the amount of sugar, which would then reduce the amount of alcohol. So that's sort of a summary of the importance of understanding Maillard reactions. If you're studying for an exam, say with the Council of Whiskey Masters or any other organization, this is a potential question that could come up if you get asked about Maillard reaction in Scotch whiskey production. You need to know, if you're talking about single malts, then you're talking about direct fire stills. And if you're talking about grain Scotch whiskey production, then you're talking about using whole grains as in part of the cooking process. Blowdown. Blowdown is when the cooked cereal slurry is discharged from a pressure cooker, generally into a flash cooling vessel or expansion tank, and there is a rapid decrease in pressure. Blowdown has the effect of mechanically releasing any remaining tightly bound starch from the grain matrix, sort of like popping popcorn. When cooked whole grains are discharged, the pipework associated in the transfer from the cooker is instrumental in ensuring the disintegration of the grains. Blowdown is a critical part of the cooking process and is normally associated with rapid but carefully controlled cooling. Poor temperature control will cause serious problems with retrogradation or setback, which will result in the cooked slurry forming a gel that is resistant to enzymic breakdown and will lead to subsequent processing problems related to viscosity, filterability, and alcohol yield. So this blowdown during the cooling process after the cooking, if it's not carefully monitored, can end up with a bunch of goo, a gel. And that gel will be difficult to have the enzyme for malted barley that you're going to want to add to it to then convert the sugar into alcohol. It's going to cause a problem with the ability to filter it, and consequently, it's going to have a problem with alcohol yield. Retrogradation. Retrogradation has been defined as a change from a dispersed amorphous state to an insoluble crystalline condition, which occurs when heated gelatinized starch begins to reassociate upon cooling, resulting in gel formation and precipitation. The process of retrogradation is very complex, but it is considered to be predominantly influenced by the relative amount of amylose present in the starch, which can be affected by heating and cooling temperatures. So retrogradation is when the gelatinized starch begins to cool and it becomes crystallized. To summarize and simplify, temperature control is very important in the cooking process as it affects the condition of the grain starch as well as the enzymes from the malted barley that are needed to convert the starch to sugar. Again, for more information on retrogradation, blowback, and the rest of this, I highly recommend reading Whiskey, Technology, Production, and Marketing, edited by Ingle Russell and Graham Stewart. Step 4, conversion. Converting starch to sugar. The enzymes within malted barley are added, which then begin to convert the starch into fermentable sugar. This then becomes the wort. In some countries, such as Canada, enzymes are allowed to be directly added into the conversion rather than derived from malted barley, but this is not permitted in Scotland. Step 5, fermentation. Converting the wort to alcohol. The wort is pumped into a fermenter where yeast is added and conversion is completed. Fermentation then takes place and the mix becomes a wash. This can vary between 48 and 100 hours. The wash will be between 8% alcohol by volume if they're using wheat to 15% alcohol by volume if they're using corn. Step 6, distillation, converting the wort to alcohol. When distilling Grain Scotch Whisky, there are 3 general options. Option 1A, coffee still. The coffee still consists of 2 tall linked columns, the analyzer and the rectifier, each of which is divided internally into compartments by perforated trays. Wash is filled into a coiled copper pipe running from the top to the bottom of the rectifier. From there, the pipe rises to the top of the analyzer where the wash is sprayed out over the top plate. It then begins to descend through the compartments. At the same time, heated steam is pumped into the bottom of the analyzer. As this rises through the perforations, it meets the descending wash, heats it up, and strips off alcohol. Option 1B, coffee still. The vapor is then piped into the foot of the rectifier and starts to rise once more. Because different alcohols fractionate at different temperatures, the spirit begins to separate into its constituent parts, with the heavier alcohols condensing into a liquid and lying on the plates. These can be collected and fed back into the analyzer. Only the lightest alcohols can therefore rise to the specific plate, where they can be condensed into new make spirit, normally between 90 and 94% alcohol by volume. While strong, coffee malts have an oilier texture than grain spirit made from the other 2 options. Option number 2, the 3-column still. In a 3-column still, the wash enters through the top of the first column, the stripping column, which removes the volatile heads. The alcohol vapor then passes through the intermediate column filled with water. Because fusel oils, a fusel oil is a mixture of several higher alcohols with more than 2 carbons, chiefly amyl alcohol, are not soluble. They rise up to the top and can be drawn off. The water and alcohol mix is extracted off the foot. The mix is then put into a rectifying column and collected as new make spirit. Option number 3, a multiple column still. The more columns that are utilized, the greater the ability to separate different flavors. Maturation, converting the new make spirit to whiskey. According to Scotch Whisky Regulations of 2009, in order for a spirit made only of water, malted barley, plus other cereal grains to be called a Scotch whisky, it must be mashed, fermented, distilled to no more than 94.8% alcohol by volume, and matured in oak casks not exceeding 700 liters for a minimum of 3 years in Scotland. Most grain whiskeys are aged in bourbon casks and mostly made from American white oak, a species high in compounds that gives aromas reminiscent of vanilla, creme brulee, cinnamon, and baking spices. time, the freshness of the cask, and type of oak all have a part to play. The cask performs 3 tasks. A. Removal. The cask helps remove aggressive new make character. B. Residual flavor compounds from the cask are extracted by the spirit. And third, interaction. The flavor compounds from the wood and spirit meld together to increase complexity. Step 8. Bottling. Making whiskey ready for sale. Grain and blended whiskey may be exported in neutral containers and bottled after export, whereas single malt must be bottled within Scotland. Prior to bottling, the producer may choose to do an additional 3 things. Option 1, chill filtration. Whiskey under 46% alcohol by volume may become cloudy when adding ice or water, so some producers choose to filter out oils and solids. This may also alter the mouthfeel and reduce flavor in the whiskey. Typically, all single malts under 46% alcohol by volume undergo some sort of cold chill filtration. However, Invergordon, their grain whiskey, which is typically bottled at 43% alcohol by volume, is non-chill filtered and has natural color. Option 2, color adjustment. Some producers may seek to reduce color variation in their bottle by adding a very small amount of caramel color, E150A. Option 3, alcohol strength adjustment. The minimum alcohol content of a Scotch whiskey is 40% alcohol by volume, but cask strength is becoming increasingly more popular. So, as I've said already, for a textbook level understanding, I want to recommend the book Whiskey Technology, Production, and Marketing, edited by Ingle Russell and Graham Stewart. So, if you are a whiskey student and you have another good textbook that you would recommend, again, not looking for the casual read, something that's more of a textbook, let me know down below, because I would like to build up my library and share with others other recommended books. I hope you enjoyed this video. My next video on Grain Scotch Whisky, I'm going to cover the 8 current grain distilleries and do a review of a single grain Scotch Whisky from Invergordon. All right, hope you enjoyed this video. As always, if you like it, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. And until next time, Slàinte. Hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out these other whiskey videos.